The air in Vicksburg in 1863 hung heavy with the smell of dust and despair. A Christian pastor, new to the besieged city, moved through a makeshift field hospital, his eyes scanning the rows of wounded. He had seen suffering before, but this place felt different, a raw wound on the land itself. Then he heard it, a ragged, desperate sound cutting through the moans and hushed prayers. A Union soldier, barely more than a boy, lay on a cot, his uniform torn, a dark stain spreading on his chest. His eyes, wide and unfocused, darted around the tent as if searching for something or someone. The soldier wasn't crying out for God, not with his first, gasping words. Instead, he choked on a name, a woman's name, and then a plea that twisted the pastor's gut. "Please, forgive me. I didn't mean to do it. She didn't deserve it. No one deserves that." His voice was thin, raspy, each word a struggle. He wasn't talking to the pastor or to any of the nearby medics. He was speaking to an invisible presence, a ghost that only he could see. The pastor stopped, a silent observer in the chaos. He had come here to offer comfort, to preach the Lord's word, but something in this soldier's plea froze him. This wasn't a general confession of sin. This was a desperate cry for forgiveness, for a specific, profound wrong, a transgression so personal it hung in the air like a foul odor. The soldier thrashed weakly, his pain physical, yes, but his torment was clearly rooted much deeper. I took everything, her dignity, her future. I saw her face, I saw her eyes. She looked at me like I was a monster. And I was. God forgive me, I was. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and a fresh wave of pain contorted his face. But even through the agony, his plea for forgiveness persisted, directed not upwards, but outwards to an implied victim who was not there to grant it. The words, though fragmented and broken by his suffering, painted a picture of profound disrespect, of cruelty inflicted deliberately. This wasn't the lament of a man who'd made a mistake in battle. This was the confession of a man who had done something truly terrible, something that gnawed at his soul even as his body failed him. The pastor watched, his face unreadable. He felt no immediate urge to rush forward, to offer the standard words of comfort or the promise of divine absolution. There was a calculated stillness in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement that this moment, this soldier's desperate confession, was only the beginning. It was a precursor, he felt, to a much larger reckoning, a dark curtain slowly pulling back to reveal an even darker stage. The soldier's suffering was evident, his breath coming in shallow gasps, but his true torment was etched in his eyes, in the ungranted plea that haunted his final moments. Justice, in its own slow, inexorable way, had a habit of finding its mark, even in the midst of war. It was a truth the pastor knew well, a truth that resonated with the quiet certainty of the gallows. The soldier's cries grew fainter, dissolving into the din of the hospital. The pastor stood there, the unsettling sense of what horrors led to this moment hanging heavy in the air, a silent promise of revelations yet to come. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The pastor, a man named Thomas, had not always moved with such measured stillness. Before the war, his life in a small northern town had been a tapestry woven with quiet devotion and predictable rhythms. He was a man of God, yes, but also a man of his community. His days were filled with sermons delivered from a worn pulpit, visits to the sick, and countless hours spent counseling young couples or comforting the grieving. His home, a modest parsonage, always smelled faintly of old books and brewing tea. He believed deeply in the inherent goodness of people, a belief that, even then, sometimes put him at odds with the harsher realities of human nature. Thomas possessed a strong moral compass, one that pointed stubbornly north, even when society seemed to drift. He preached about love and forgiveness, certainly, but also about truth and justice. He wasn't afraid to speak out against local injustices, whether it was unfair labor practices at the mill or the subtle prejudices that simmered beneath the town's polite surface. His idealism was a core part of him, almost naive in its unwavering strength. He held a profound, almost innocent belief in universal redemption, that given enough guidance and grace, any soul could find its way back to the light. He dreamed of a world where peace reigned, where Christian values guided every action, every decision. His vision was clear, uncomplicated by the horrors he would later witness. But the world outside his quiet parish was changing. and the rumblings of conflict, at first distant whispers, grew louder. The shadow of the Civil War began to stretch across the land, slowly encroaching upon his peaceful existence. The passionate debates in town, the grim faces of young men enlisting, the tearful goodbyes at the train station, each chipped away at his serene world, forcing him to confront a reality far harsher than any he had known. The abstract concepts of right and wrong, of justice and sin, were suddenly taking on flesh and blood, stained with powder and blood. As the war escalated, so did Thomas's internal struggle. He couldn't stand idly by. His faith demanded action, not just prayer. It was this conviction, this deeply ingrained humanitarian spirit, that eventually led him to Vicksburg. He didn't come as a soldier, nor as a partisan, but as a servant of God, driven by a simple mission: to aid the wounded, to offer comfort and spiritual solace to any man who needed it, regardless of the uniform he wore. Union or Confederate, it made no difference in the eyes of his God or in his own heart. The journey itself had been long and arduous, a harsh education in the brutal landscape of war. He saw towns ravaged, fields burned, families displaced. He witnessed suffering that no sermon could ever truly capture. These experiences, the constant exposure to pain and despair, had slowly begun to temper his idealism, hardening him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It explained, perhaps, his initial stoicism in the face of the dying soldier's plea. He had seen so much, heard so many desperate cries, that his immediate reaction was no longer shock but a calculated assessment, a quiet resilience born of necessity. His heart still ached, but it also knew how to brace itself. He understood that in war the wounds of the soul often ran far deeper than those of the body, and that some pleas for forgiveness were not meant for him to grant, but for the universe to weigh. This journey, this immersion into the raw truth of human conflict, had shaped him, preparing him for the deeper darkness he was yet to uncover in Vicksburg. The journey to Vicksburg had been more than just a physical passage. It was a slow, grinding erosion of Thomas's initial idealism. Every mile deeper into the war-torn South chipped away at his belief that humanity, at its core, was good and redeemable. He had seen the promises of a quick end to the conflict dissolve into prolonged, brutal trench warfare. He heard the endless hollow assurances from both sides that victory was just around the corner, while the casualty lists grew longer and longer. These weren't just abstract numbers. They were faces, stories, families. He remembered a small farming village not far from the Mississippi where he had stopped for water. The people there, mostly women and old men, lived under a constant cloud of fear. Both Union and Confederate troops had passed through, each demanding food, shelter, and loyalty. He saw the veiled humiliations they endured, the quiet indignities forced upon them as they tried to survive. A Union officer, young and arrogant, had once taken their last sack of flour, leaving a family with small children nothing but roots to eat. When Thomas had tried to intervene, the officer had simply laughed, saying, "They're rebels, preacher. They get what they deserve." The injustice of it had burned in Thomas, a cold fire in his gut. Then there was the growing chasm he observed between Christian teachings and wartime actions. He heard sermons from chaplains on both sides, twisting scripture to justify bloodshed, portraying their enemies as agents of the devil. The words, "God is on our side," became a weapon used to dehumanize and incite. The very faith he had dedicated his life to was being warped, contorted into something ugly and unrecognizable. He saw soldiers, fresh from hearing a sermon about brotherly love, turn around and commit acts of unimaginable cruelty. He witnessed the casual disregard for human life, the way men became numbers, then simply forgotten. He remembered a young Confederate soldier, barely more than a boy, who had been captured and left to die of his wounds because the Union Field Hospital was too full for an enemy. Thomas had tried to tend to him but was pulled away by a stern doctor who told him to save his efforts for our boys. The boy's eyes, wide with pain and fear, haunted Thomas for weeks. It wasn't the enemy he saw, but a child, someone's son, dying alone. These were the accumulated cracks in his emotional armor. Each incident, each broken promise, each act of injustice was a tiny fissure in his once unshakable faith in humanity. The Vicksburg campaign, with its relentless siege and unimaginable suffering, felt like the final heavy blow to his idealism. He had seen the moral compromises people made, not just soldiers but civilians too, driven by desperation or fear. He had watched as people turned on each other, as the veneer of civilization thinned under the pressure of survival. So, when that wounded soldier in Vicksburg had begged for forgiveness, his plea wasn't an isolated shock to Thomas. It was the culmination of everything he had witnessed, a stark echo of the moral decay that had spread across the land like a plague. It was the final straw in a long series of heart-wrenching encounters, confirming his deepest fears about what war did to the human soul. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the soldier's desperate cries were not just about a single act, but about a soul drowning in the collective sin of a nation at war, a soul that had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The weight of all this sorrow, all this brokenness, settled in Thomas's chest, heavy and cold. The emotional atmosphere in Vicksburg grew heavier day by day, becoming almost impossible to bear as the siege tightened its grip around the city. Thomas, the pastor, found himself spending most of his time in the makeshift hospitals, witnessing the raw, unfiltered suffering of soldiers from both sides, alongside the growing number of civilians caught in the crossfire. The air inside the crowded tents was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. Every groan, every whispered prayer, every choked sob added to the oppressive weight he carried. Resources dwindled with frightening speed. Food became scarce, clean water even scarcer, and medical supplies were almost non-existent. Thomas saw arguments erupt daily over tiny portions of hardtack or a few precious drops of medicine. He watched as desperate mothers fought over a crust of bread for their starving children, their eyes hollow with a hunger that went beyond the physical. These were not the grand battles he had read about. These were small, ugly fights for survival, stripping away dignity piece by piece. The social pressures within the besieged city also intensified. There was an unspoken expectation to conform, to display unwavering loyalty to the Confederate cause, even as hope faded. Thomas, with his quiet demeanor and his refusal to openly condemn either side, found himself viewed with suspicion by some. He was a man of God, yes, but why wasn't he rallying the troops with fiery sermons against the invaders? Why did he spend as much time tending to a Union prisoner as he did to a Confederate soldier? His neutrality, once a source of quiet strength, now felt like a burden, a target for those who saw the world in stark black and white. He felt the weight of judgment from both sides. Some of the Confederate officers saw his unwavering faith as naive, a weakness in a time that demanded hardened resolve. They wanted a God who would deliver victory, not one who preached compassion for the enemy. On the other hand, some of the Union soldiers he occasionally encountered during brief truces for burying the dead, or when he ventured outside the city walls to check on isolated farms, looked at him with a mix of pity and contempt. To them, he was a man clinging to outdated ideals in a world that had moved past such niceties. Their sneers spoke volumes. "What good is your God here, preacher?" The general moral degradation among some soldiers and even civilians worsened as the siege dragged on. He saw men who had once been decent, driven to petty theft, to hoarding, to callous indifference. He witnessed acts of cruelty that had nothing to do with warfare, but everything to do with a breakdown of basic human decency. A young boy caught stealing a handful of corn was beaten without mercy. A woman accused of being a Union sympathizer was publicly shamed and ostracized, her small store looted. These were not isolated incidents. They were becoming the norm, a new, brutal reality under the constant bombardment and starvation. This was the moment of greatest emotional suffocation for Thomas. Each day was a struggle to maintain his own faith, to find a reason to keep going when all around him the world seemed to be tearing itself apart. The sounds of cannon fire were a constant backdrop to the cries of the wounded and the hungry. The city was a cage, and he felt its walls closing in on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. His idealism, already fractured, threatened to shatter completely. He questioned everything he had ever believed about God, about humanity, about his own purpose. The weight of all this suffering, the endless cycle of violence and desperation pressed down on him, pushing him to the very edge of his endurance. He knew a breaking point was coming, not just for the city, but for him personally. The question was, what would be left of him when it finally arrived? The breaking point arrived, not with another cannon blast or a desperate plea, but with a quiet, sickening discovery. Thomas was helping to clear out a makeshift hospital tent, a place that had seen too much pain, too many deaths. They were packing up old supplies, trying to salvage anything usable before the next wave of shelling. Underneath a pile of blood-soaked bandages and discarded medical instruments, he found a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't a military record, it was a personal diary, tucked away as if its owner meant for it to stay hidden forever. He almost put it down, respecting the privacy of the dead, but something urged him to open it. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. The first few pages were mundane, entries about daily life, the weather, hopes for the war to end. Then, the entries changed. They became darker, filled with a chilling account of events that made his blood run cold. The journal belonged to a young woman, a civilian from a small farm just outside the city, a farm Thomas had passed many times on his rare excursions. Her words, written with a mixture of terror and resignation, described a forced entry into her home, not by desperate foragers, but by a small group of Union soldiers. She detailed the theft of her family's meager possessions, the destruction of what little they had left. But what truly shattered Thomas was the description of her younger sister, just a child, being taken away. The journal didn't explicitly state what happened, but the fear, the frantic, broken sentences, the desperate pleas for her sister's return, and the sudden, chilling silence in the entries that followed painted a picture more horrifying than any direct confession. Then a name appeared, scrawled almost illegibly on a later page, alongside a small, distinctive drawing of a locket. It was the name of a soldier, a specific Union soldier, and the locket was one Thomas recognized. It was the very locket he had seen around the neck of the wounded soldier who had begged for forgiveness in the field, the same soldier whose desperate cries had first unsettled him. This wasn't some random act of war. This was a targeted, personal cruelty, a violation that went beyond the battlefield. The journal detailed how this soldier, the one now lying broken and pleading, had been a leader in that terrible act, had been the one who had taken the child. This discovery hit Thomas with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a story, it was a direct, irrefutable link. The man begging for forgiveness wasn't just guilty of some general wartime sin, he was guilty of a specific, heinous act against a defenseless child. The unseen victim from his earlier prayer now had a name, a family, a story of profound suffering. His remaining idealism, already hanging by a thread, snapped. He had believed in universal redemption, in the capacity for good within every soul, even those hardened by war. Now, looking at the words in that journal, he saw something else entirely, a darkness so profound it felt almost irredeemable. He felt a wave of nausea, a mix of anger, despair, and a chilling sense of betrayal. His own beliefs about forgiveness and justice, which had been his anchors in this storm, now felt like naive fantasies. This was a moment of profound moral reckoning. He had witnessed so much suffering, so much inhumanity, but this felt different. This was a deliberate, calculated evil, not born of the heat of battle or the desperation of starvation, but of something far colder. The journal felt heavy in his hands, not just with the weight of paper and leather, but with the burden of truth. This discovery completely broke the cycle of passive observation. He could no longer simply watch, pray, and offer comfort. This demanded more. It demanded action. His path, which had been one of quiet spiritual guidance, now veered sharply into the treacherous territory of justice. The siege of Vicksburg had changed him, but this journal, this hidden truth, had fundamentally reshaped his very purpose. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not ignore this. This was the turning point, setting him on a new, dangerous path. The weight of the journal pressed down on Thomas, not just physically, but spiritually. He felt an immense internal turmoil, a churning in his gut that went beyond simple nausea. Doubt, a feeling he rarely allowed himself to entertain about his faith, began to creep in. How could a God of love allow such evil to fester, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of men who claimed to fight for a cause? Fear, cold and sharp, also pricked at him. Exposing this truth, especially against a Union soldier, could put his own life in danger. Vicksburg was a city under siege where loyalties were fiercely held and dissent was not tolerated. He was a pastor, a man of God, but even he understood the brutal realities of war. A profound sense of shame regarding humanity's capacity for evil washed over him. He had seen men do terrible things, but this felt different. This was a deliberate act against a child, a violation that twisted something fundamental within him. He found himself questioning everything he believed about human nature, about redemption. Was forgiveness even possible for such a crime? It was during one of his rounds in the makeshift hospital, his mind still reeling from the journal's contents, that he encountered Sergeant Miller again. Miller was a medic, a man whose face was etched with the grim realities of countless battles, his eyes holding a cynical wisdom Thomas had come to respect. Miller saw the distress on Thomas's face, a look he rarely showed. "Pastor, you look like you've seen a ghost," Miller said, his voice raspy from too many nights without sleep. He had a way of cutting through pleasantries, a directness born of constant exposure to suffering. Thomas hesitated, then decided to trust the medic. He briefly, vaguely mentioned a discovery, a terrible injustice not related to the fighting. Miller listened, his expression unreadable as Thomas skirted around the specifics, careful not to reveal too much. "Some things, Pastor," Miller finally said, leaning back against a blood-stained wall, "are best left buried, especially in a war like this. You stir up too much, you might find yourself buried right alongside them." It wasn't a threat, but pragmatic advice, a warning born of experience. Miller offered a form of protection, not with a weapon, but with his street smarts, his understanding of the unspoken rules of survival in a war zone. He didn't condone what Thomas hinted at, but he understood the danger of challenging the system. "Keep your head down, Pastor. Do your good work. That's enough." But Thomas knew it wasn't enough, not anymore. Later that week, a different kind of encounter occurred. Chaplain Davies, a man whose sermons were more fire and brimstone about the righteousness of the Union cause than about Christian charity, approached Thomas. Davies was a staunch believer in the war, seeing it as a holy crusade. He had heard whispers, no doubt from some of the soldiers Thomas had been ministering to, about Thomas's quiet, questioning demeanor, his lack of outright condemnation for the Confederates. "Pastor Thomas," Davies boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the crowded tent, "I hear you've been wrestling with some difficult truths. Remember, God is on our side. We must maintain morale, uphold the sacred duty of our soldiers." Davies's words felt like a veiled threat, an attempt to suppress any truth that might undermine the war effort or the image of the Union Army. He was an antagonist, not through malice, but through a fanatical adherence to his own version of truth, one that prioritized victory above all else. He was careful, though, never to directly accuse Thomas of anything, simply to remind him of his duty to the cause. The strict social and military hierarchies of 1863 Vicksburg meant that a chaplain, especially one so vocal, held considerable sway. The psychological impact on Thomas was profound. He felt isolated, caught between the brutal pragmatism of Miller and the rigid dogma of Davies. His calling, which had once felt so clear, now seemed murky, fraught with impossible choices. He had come to Vicksburg to offer spiritual comfort, to heal souls. But what if healing meant exposing a wound that others wanted to keep hidden? What if justice had to come before comfort? He questioned his very purpose, his ability to make a difference. The weight of the world and the horrifying truth he carried felt crushing. He knew he couldn't ignore it. Thomas found himself at a crossroads. The spiritual comfort he had offered for so long now felt insufficient, a bandage on a gaping wound that needed deeper treatment. His mission, once simply about solace, now shifted. He saw that true healing, true redemption, required acknowledging the rot beneath the surface. He decided to pursue justice, not for vengeance, but for truth. The soldier's transgression, that personal cruelty he had uncovered, could not remain buried. He began to document everything. He revisited the places, carefully noting details, speaking to the few people who had been indirectly affected or who had witnessed fragments of the event. He did this quietly, meticulously, always aware of Miller's pragmatic warning and Davies's watchful eye. He learned to move through the camp like a shadow, gathering pieces of information, cross-referencing stories, and piecing together the grim picture. It was a slow, dangerous process. Each confirmed detail was a heavy stone added to his burden, but also a small step towards clarity. His efforts were not about a public trial, not about a military court. He understood the realities of war, the way such things could be swept under the rug for the sake of morale. His aim was different, to create an undeniable record, a testament to what had happened that could not be easily dismissed. He wrote late into the night, by the flickering light of a stolen candle, his hand aching, his heart heavy. He described the victim, their fear, the soldiers' casual cruelty, and the silence that followed. He included the fragmented pleas for forgiveness he had heard, placing them in the context of the soldiers' full, awful actions. The final consequence for the soldier came not from a judge, but from the slow, steady drip of truth. Thomas didn't shout it from the rooftops. Instead, he presented his findings to a few trusted senior officers, men who, despite the war, still held a sense of honor. He didn't demand action. He simply presented the facts quietly, soberly. He let the truth speak for itself. The soldier was not formally court-martialed for that specific act. Instead, a series of subtle changes began. He was transferred to the most dangerous, thankless duties, always on the front lines, exposed to constant peril. His comrades, once oblivious or indifferent, began to look at him differently. Whispers spread, not of a specific crime, but of a man who carried a heavy, unspoken burden, a man who had done something truly unforgivable. He became ostracized, a ghost among the living, his pleas for forgiveness now hollow, echoing only in his own tormented mind. The public exposure was subtle, a social shunning more effective than any prison sentence. He was left alone with his conscience, a torment more profound than any physical punishment. Thomas watched from a distance. There was no triumph in his heart, only a quiet, weary satisfaction that truth had found its way. He saw the soldier, gaunt and haunted, his eyes always darting, never settling. The man's physical wounds had healed, but the wounds of his soul festered, raw and exposed. He had begged for forgiveness, but forgiveness, Thomas now understood, was not a gift to be given lightly. It had to be earned, to be sought through genuine repentance and acknowledgement of wrongdoing, not through a desperate plea in the throes of death. The pastor found a renewed sense of purpose. His faith was not shattered, but transformed. He still offered comfort, still ministered to the wounded and the dying, but now with a deeper understanding of the human heart, its capacity for both good and evil. He knew that true redemption was a hard road, paved with honesty and accountability. The war would end, the cannons would fall silent, but the scars, both physical and moral, would remain. Thomas would continue his work, no longer naive but resolute, understanding that even in the darkest times, the pursuit of truth and a quiet, persistent justice could bring a semblance of peace, not just to the victims, but to the world. He had learned that sometimes the greatest act of faith was to shine a light into the darkest corners, letting conscience do its work.